Tēnā koe, Lawrence. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on the podcast today. It's a privilege to sit alongside you, bro.
Kyod.
Welcome.
Kyod.
Bro, really keen to learn a little bit more about your early days. So can you tell me a little bit about those early years and some of the experiences or things that shaped the man sitting alongside me today?
Right. Tuatahi, he iri tēnei no Ngāti Tau Ngāti Whāua, me ngai tūhoi. Whānau from up north, but grew up down in Autonomy. I'll get personal to start off with. A very
Please
personal
do,
story.
bro.
That used to be quite embarrassing growing up, but I kind of lean into it now.
Okay.
So when my parents didn't know that they were having me, so my mum didn't know that she was pregnant with me. She just had my sister.
Okay.
And they were living on Littleton Street in Barrington.
Yep. No, it will.
And my mum had like a really sore puku, and she just thought she had to go toilet.
Yeah.
And then she jumps on the toilet, and my head pops out.
Really?
I was born in the bath at Littleton Street. So my middle name is Mihoru. Surprise. So
yep.
I surprised the world when I showed up as a young person, and I guess have leaned into that growing up as part of my story.
Absolutely.
And it's usually a good icebreaker, I think.
Yeah, I'll say. Far out. Certainly broke the ice in this kōrero, bro.
Well, I've shared it at big conferences, and people have. It's made people laugh, but in recent times, it's just about leaning into that idea around being surprised, I guess, or surprising people, being a bit of an underdog. So,
and special, that's Mihoru, special.
Right, special, surprise, however you want to roll with it. So, quite an embarrassing story growing up as a kid. But
I don't know if it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like you said, you just lean into it. It's just part of your story.
Yeah.
How, were you, I'm interested to know, were you quite prem or?
I think it's full term, yeah.
Full term?
Yeah, so I was sitting at the back of towards my mum's spine, so it wasn't
she
showing.
Must have been uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
You do hear those stories, though, from time to time.
Yeah.
Far out. That's cool.
Yeah, but also I think one of the other things is like the idea of not being a hassle. So typically growing up, I kind of just gone with the flow and being quite flexible, and that's kind of shown up in my adult life, that I'm a relatively flexible person.
That's
compared to my younger brother, who's took 24 hours to come out and has been hoha growing up. But
Hautatu, eh?
Yeah, he's the hautatu.
He's the Maui of the whānau.
Right. And then I think at a kind of primary school age, we decided to move up to Wonganui.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a few years up there, went to primary school there, and was in Castle Cliff, which is probably the hood of Wonganui.
Oh, okay.
So we grew up, I guess, surrounded by gangs, drug, alcohol culture.
Yeah.
And then my mum made a decision to leave my father and come down to Christchurch, which was, I guess, a pivotal decision because I look at some of the stories of people that we grew up with in gangs, drugs, prison, all that kind of stuff. There was a clear trajectory for us as tamariki if we were to stay there. So a hard decision, but a really good decision for my mother to move from Wonganui back down to Christchurch. And we continued as tamariki down here. And then kind of grew up, went through schooling. My father came down and rekindled his relationship with my mum. And probably I would have been about 10. My father had his first heart attack. So he's a taha Māori side. He kind of grew up in Rotorua, was a part of the trades movement down to Ōtautahi.
I was going to say, is that how you ended up down here in Ōtautahi, the Māori trades training back in the, what was that, 60s or something?
Back in the day, however long ago it was. He hitchhiked down here from Rotorua.
Cool.
And then, had a heart attack probably around 10. And then that was a ongoing kind of process for us as a whānau. So diabetes came along.
Did he live or?
No. He passed away when I was 14.
Oh.
So between probably 10 and 14, we spent nearly every day in the hospital. With him going through, I guess for Māori, it's kind of a common story around health and well-being. So poor lifestyle, didn't exercise, didn't eat well, and it started to show up probably at quite a young age for him. So as kids, our playground was the hospital. We'd spend every day after school at hospital, instead of playing sport or being with our mates, would be in the hospital playing on wheelchairs and causing a ruckus at the hospital. So for us, that was the new norm, I guess, was being at the hospital every day to visit him.
Every day?
Yeah.
So was he pretty much like a permanent patient there, was he?
Yeah, I think he spent like long periods of time in the hospital. It started with diabetes, and then it went into heart failure, kidney failure. He was a smoker, so there were some complications around that.
Yeah.
And then as he kind of went through that process, lost a few limbs. So he lost both his legs, ended up in a wheelchair.
Wow.
And then, I guess part of our journey was essentially looking after him as kids. So we're looking after our dad and kind of getting him out of bed, in and out of bed, supporting him with his everyday life, and then progressively got worse over time. And passed away when I was 14, which was, I guess, a really formative years for us and for me personally. I'm the oldest brother, so being the oldest male, you've kind of got to step into
father figure
or whether you choose to or not, you've taken on the responsibility of being in that role.
You probably feel the pressure as well, eh?
Yeah, and I felt the pressure of looking after my whānau, being there for my siblings and my mum, and kind of going through that high school stage a little bit lost. I mean, those simple things that you might learn as a young tāne, you're not getting from your father, you're having to figure out on your own or from other people around you. So
what sort of things are you talking about, do you think, looking back on those days?
Yeah, I think what it means to be a man, that kind of journey of going through boyhood into teenagehood and then into being a man was a big missing kind of piece for me. I got it through whānau, through my some particular people like my uncle, but I guess those values or those kind of things that you might get from a father weren't instilled at a young age for me. So it took a massive rock to my confidence. And for some people, they might go outwardly and they go, behavior, choices that they make might be the thing that an indication of not getting that support. For me, it was internal. I went quiet. I didn't try hard at school, didn't do anything really at school, just kind of went under the radar. No one knew what was going on around me apart from my own family. So held on to lots of that stuff as a rangatahi, and didn't want to showcase who I was, and didn't really know who I was in that stage. So had to go on a journey of learning what it means to be a man, kind of on my own. I had some people around me, but and then at about 19, after finishing school, I ended up in fatherhood. So being a 19-year-old and raising a tamaiti became my new chapter,
the new norm,
and a lot of learning. I think being 19, being a kid, raising another kid,
steep learning curve,
was a big steep learning curve for me. And being a boy, having to be a father for a boy as well was something foreign for anybody. But
of course,
not having that kind of father figure, or the father that kind of instills those things, I had to figure that out on my own a little bit. And it took a long time,
of course,
to figure all that stuff out. And then I guess the thing with having a young whānau is you've got to step into that provider role pretty early. So I felt the pressure of doing that. Did a little bit of study. I wouldn't say that study was my strong point, but growing up, movement and physical activity had always been a big part of my journey and my identity. So I went into personal training and learning about that and what it looks like to support whānau with their physical activity needs.
Personal training is a tough gig, eh?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
I know lots of people that have amazing athletes that have had a go at trying to make a living doing personal training, and some crack it, but it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
How did you find it?
It was tough. I mean, you go through the study and you kind of get the knowledge and somewhat of the skill, but I didn't. Finding a job or finding a personal training role was really hard. So I kind of just took it on myself to do my own thing. And I just started talking to whānau and friends and started to work out with them at home and train them at home. And so started to look at, well, if you're not willing to go to the gym, then I'll come to you and I'll turn up on their doorstep and I'd use whatever equipment they had in their whare.
Skipping rope.
Yeah, sometimes cans of stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Whatever they had, there's no excuse to not be active. And I think one of the stories that came out from that was a whānau member who hadn't run for since they had before they had kids, and through that journey, eventually got to a point where they could run.
Wow.
And that
That's
was
massive.
a really big learning for me. But yeah, did that on my own. Started to train a few friends that were dabbling in kind of athletics and a kickboxer, and that was a good learning journey. And then kind of just stuck at the personal training for a wee while, and ended up working in the gym for a bit. But the biggest learning for me in that space was relationships. So I was a shy fella, didn't really like talk to people, but I got pushed into having to understand people and ask questions and understand behaviour. And that was my biggest learning coming out of that kind of teenage period into being an adult and working, was the importance of relationships. And there's nothing like turning up on someone's doorstep to do a workout and trying to motivate them on all that kind of stuff. But a big part of that was how do you build relationships that are reciprocal, and they're willing to be motivated in that space as well. We did a bit of stuff around behaviour, so Kai and how we might work on motivation as well. So one thing is getting people physically active, another thing is getting them out the door. So trying to reduce some of those barriers was part of the gig as well.
What do you mean by that? You mean getting them were people inclined to be physically active inside the home but not outside? Or do you mean
I think it's probably looking at it from like a progressive point of view, that to expect somebody who might not have worked out for their whole life to then go to a gym is a big step. So
massive. How
do you baby step them into that? So go into their whare where they feel most comfortable, show them ways of exercising in their home, and then progressively work towards getting into maybe group settings or into the gym. So that was a big part of it. Everyone that I worked with was Māori, except one Indian fellow that kind of worked alongside, and supported him. But a really good learning process, not just the physical activity component, but understanding humans and the way they behave.
Well, I think that's what I was talking about before. Like I know got a lot of good mates that have, like I said, awesome athletes, know their way around the gym, know everything about the body and how it works and all the rest of it. Nutrition, got it dialed in, but in order to succeed in that world, it's as much about that as it is about the relationships and how to convince someone to even hand you money to train them. It's not just about the training; it's about all of the other things that go with it. But it sounds like you picked up some of that stuff along the way, which is awesome.
I think my working career is where I started to really find myself and start to come out of my shell. I recognise that yes, I'm introverted, but I can talk to people of all walks of life,
of course,
and I can build relationships and I guess learn from others. So, big part of that journey was kind of learning who I was as well, and figuring out what's important to me and where do I want to be. And so, coming out of the personal training world, I recognised that tamariki and rangatahi were an area of interest for me and how I could support them, and ended up at a place that supported young people that were either in the care system or kind of in tricky situations, I guess, and we provided respite care. But the thing that I was doing was adventure-based learning, so we would take them out into the ngahere, into the environment, and do different activities with tamariki rangatahi to kind of build some of that confidence, start thinking about hauora and well-being. But what I found, especially for our tāne, who struggled a lot, was walking was probably one of the biggest tools that were supportive for them. So we'd go on these bush walks for an hour, 2 hours, and the backgrounds or the experiences growing up, there were some pretty tough stories, but for the boys walking, you just walk alongside them and they just start chatting and opening up, and there was opportunities for relationship and learning. And there was a big another area for me to learn about how to support people.
Walking's so underrated, I reckon. And I think a couple of things there, especially with tāne, I find walking's a really good way to get someone to open up, because like this, eye contact, sitting opposite each other can be awkward, especially if you're discussing something that's super personal. But when you're standing side by side, walking alongside them, or driving in the car even, when you don't have to make eye contact, often people relax a little bit, especially tāne. So I can definitely see how going on a walk would put people, because eventually, you get a bit bored, I might as well talk. Well, I've got some people here, got good company. Oh, that's awesome. Those are good experiences.
Yeah, I think activating the body is a really big part of that for our tāne as well.
Yeah.
Just get them moving.
Yep.
Then they start to open up. And it's probably something that I took from the personal training background was, they're doing activity and you're a personal trainer first, but you eventually become, they start to confide in you and look for advice. And so you become somewhat of a counselor in some way. And
Yep.
I think for personal trainers, they need to recognize that they
Part of
take
the
on
role.
that role, whether they choose to or not. So it's a skill set that needs to be built as well.
It's part of holder, right?
Right.
I mean, yeah, we all often talk about those known models, whare tapawhā, for example. But yeah, there's the physical element to it. But like you just touched on, there's all that mental and sometimes spiritual and emotional and all that other stuff that can go on that personal trainers, the good ones anyway. They really want to get the best out of their clients. Yeah,
from a holder perspective, it's recognizing that all of those domains are really important and that some need to be developed before you develop the other things. So physical, your taha tinana, your physical side might be the area that is showing up first, but in reality, there might be something deeper around your hinengaro or whatever that needs to be grow and developed before you can feel confident or motivated to be physically active. And I think sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction to just be like, oh, we'll get you in the gym.
Let's go for a run.
Yeah. When in reality, there's some deeper stuff going on there. If you don't have the relationship, can't be kind of worked on to get them to that point. And that's going back to the personal training stuff, being in their whare. That's their space. That's their domain. And so you're coming into that space and they feel comfortable there. You're kind of working around what their needs are and identifying through that process how can I show up in this space rather than I'm just here to drill you on physical activity.
And do some burpees.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome.
What is actually going on for you that might be preventing you from getting in the gym or being physically active?
Right, there's so much there to unpack. I'm really keen to sort of go back and understand a little bit about those formative years that you touched on, 10 to 14, spending all of those after schools and weekends, no doubt, in the hospital that became your playground, I think is what you said. And then, of course, losing your father at the age of 14 must have been devastating. How do you think, looking back on that now, how do you think that pivotal moment in your life shaped your perspective, how you took on becoming a man, becoming a father? How did losing your father shape the man that you have become today, do you think?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I think it's shaped my purpose. So if I think about the conditions that the old man had, plus every other Māori that probably passed away of similar kind of similar conditions, they're preventable. So there are things that we can do that might stop or slow us down from getting diabetes or heart failure or anything like that. So it's added to my purpose. I already had movement as a big part of my world, but now I see that movement can be a thing that can change people's lives. So it's added to my purpose as a man and as a father to see that the thing that I love, being movement, has much more power to it than just being physically active. I think it can shift commonly held beliefs about Māori or the experience of Māori and can kind of shape who we are as an identity. And has been my driving forces. Some people, their calling is to there might be te reo, it might be haka or whatever, which all incorporate similar things. But for me, it's been movement has been my connection to that. As a father, it shaped me in many ways. Losing my parent at a young age, so raising 3 boys.
You got 3 boys now.
Yeah.
I only knew about 1.
Yeah, so
3 boys.
3 boys, all at different stages of their lives. So
half a touch team.
Yeah, half a touch team, a quarter of a Kyod team.
Okay, cool.
So raising 3 boys and being the father that I wanted, and my father was a part of that as well. So I think a big thing for me is being present in their lives. So much of what I've done has around mahi, around the things that I do, have been the common thing that I will continue to do is be present in my kids' lives. And it's showing up to sport, that's showing up to school when they need me, and it's showing up in their lives. And I guess that's come from that, not having, even when my father was alive, he wasn't a present father. Drugs, alcohol, all that kind of stuff was a big part of his world. So I guess leaning into the things that you might want in your father, And there were things that we did with him that are part of our memories, like growing up fishing. Was a big part of that. But the thing that was missing was it's that kind of saying, you give a man a fish who can eat for a day, you give him the tools to fish and he can feed for a lifetime. We were given the fish. And now my role as a father is to give them the tools to fish for a lifetime. So I guess fishing is a really good analogy for me, because now I take my boys out fishing, and it's not about me, it's about giving them the skills to be able to be in that space, and what are the tools that they need to be able to catch a fish, and how do they respect that fish, and I guess you're connected to the taiao, to the natural world. We can have opportunities to learn about ourselves and our connection to the sea and to kai as well.
And like you said, opportunity to be there, to show up, to be present, to connect with them, have all sorts of father-son moments.
And I think my learning going into fatherhood is my role within the family is different than I had perceived. So
interesting. In what way?
I think it's that stuff around boundaries, being firm, values, all that kind of stuff that I see my role in the whānau being. Like I can nurture when I need to, but I see my role being around installing values, providing skills, and I guess that capability is a really big part of it. When men feel adequate and they feel like they've got something to contribute to their whānau or to a wider community, then they get a sense of purpose or value in that space. And I think a big part for me has been, how do I add purpose or value to the lives around me, but also for my kids as well. So I guess being that father is a big part of my journey. And it's been a learning. Like I didn't get it right at the start. There were so many opportunities to learn that I didn't take on, but over time it's been a big learning journey for me, and start reflecting on how should I be as a father, and how should I show up? What am I role modeling? And I think for boys especially, play fighting or wrestling has been one of the biggest tools that I've used to connect with my sons. Like it's an opportunity to connect physically, so there's some form of affection, but cuddling or whatever isn't really a thing that you might get the odd cuddle or whatever, but when we're wrestling, we're in it, and there's that connection that's building over time. And I think about it like a puppy, and they're like rolling around and connecting with you. And I think there's some stuff around that kind of the love hormone kind of comes out in males when we wrestle with our fathers or with each other, compared to with our mothers, it might be through affection and hugging. That's how we might get that kind of oxytocin. I think that's what it is, released. But for our boys, it's rough and tumble. It's,
I actually agree.
Opportunities for risk. It's opportunities to test themselves, and a bit of competition's been good for our boys growing up.
And to remind them who's boss.
Still,
until the day that you're not. And you're like, it's all right, I wasn't trying.
I can still beat you in a race. I can still lift more than you. And the day that changes, I'll concede. But for now, it's role modeling what that looks like. And for our boys, they're growing up seeing my partner and I being physically active all the time. They're growing, in a generation that we grew up in. You might have gone to the pub with your parents, and it's what you might have seen growing up. But for us, it's about shifting that, and they're seeing us work out, they're seeing us playing sport, they're just there, and they're seeing us in Māori spaces. And so we're shifting that narrative for our boys to see that physical activity is a normal thing, connecting with whānau and other people is a normal thing, and you can do that without alcohol or without these kind of possible negative mechanisms that might be a connector for people, but can physical activity be that? So that's again, awesome, the narrative around physical activity is shifting for our whānau as well.
You're really, I guess, breaking that cycle in your whānau and creating, like you said, or reshaping the narrative around what it means to move. You talked a little bit just now about smoking. You touched on, obviously, you grew up in an environment where drugs and alcohol, smoking, maybe were around. What are some of the things that you've put in place for you and your whānau, some of the non-negotiables when it comes to that kind of stuff, kai, smoking, alcohol? How do you see the world now?
Well, I think for us, it's we've seen it. So we've seen the potential harm. I think particularly for smoking, my father grew up smoking, so always saw that it was just something that we just didn't do. And for depending on when you start smoking, it becomes the identity. It becomes the thing that might connect people. The excuse to go outside might be smoking, but for us it
becomes a social thing as well.
Yeah. For us, it's just been, well, we're not going to smoke, and we're not going to kind of demonstrate that. In terms of drinking alcohol, I think drinking and drugs, I think having kids young and then still being exposed to that kind of stuff was a journey, and we, everyone kind of goes through that journey around those experimentations, and I guess it was trickier when you're raising kids to kind of start thinking about that and what you're role modeling. But it just got to a point, I think, with drinking and partying where Sunday you wake up with a hangover. Your kids do not care if you have a hangover or not. They're up, they're ready to go.
They're ready to go.
They don't sleep in. They don't rest for a day. Having 3 energetic boys, they're ready to go. So I think with alcohol, it just became a practical thing in many ways, that if we are true to showing up for our kids and we are wanting to be present for our sons, then being hungover probably wasn't the best thing to be doing on a Sunday. And everyone has their thing, and it's not a judgment on them, but for us it was, well, firstly you feel like shit on a Sunday, and that's the whole day gone. And you only get 2 days on a weekend when you're at my hair there. That's a whole day gone where you could be doing stuff with your kids.
Wrestling.
Yeah, you could be wrestling, could be out. We found surfing as a whānau.
Oh, yeah.
And so
I'm rubbish at surfing.
Yeah, I mean, we did it for a birthday, and then we just caught the bug, and we just got into it and got obsessed about it. And so that became a part of our journey, our identity again, connection to te taiao, to nature, and a physical activity. There's no dopamine hit greater than catching a wave, I don't think. There's no better feeling than when you've caught a wave on your own, or therapeutically when you're at the back on the water, just sitting there, and you're just connected with such a bigger source than yourself.
It humbles you, eh?
Definitely. Water definitely humbles you. Days it can be flat and you're cool, and other days you're like pumping in the whitewash and you're getting tipped over, you're getting the board smacked, and there's lots to learn, I think, from nature. And I think we're aiming to be connected. Again, thinking about hauora, it's not just about your physical well-being, it's about connecting to the whenua. The taiao has been a part of our journey as well. So again, there's lots of mechanisms to do that, and it's been a big part of our journey, and another thing that we'll install in our kids.
Oh, it's awesome, bro. So you just sort of mentioned it before. Hauora, it's not just about physical activity. You've touched on the taiao. Anything else that, what does good hauora look like? Are you aiming for something in particular? Are there some non-negotiables?
It's probably more of a journey than anything, right? And so it's the process that you go on, progressively learning and reflecting over time. I think would be foolish to think that we've got hauora locked down from the get-go. It's a bit of a life journey for us. One of the things that I guess in my 20s I really struggled with was some mental health stuff that I kind of swept under the rug, and I kind of like, toughen up, harden up kind of stuff.
Pretty common.
Yeah, common for tāne.
That's the story, right? Everyone gets told to harden up, take a concrete pill.
Yeah, and I guess growing up, the macho thing was there around. Well, you don't talk about it. It's that's not something that you share with people around you. So I often didn't really turn to people when I was going through these challenges. But I found probably mid-20s that I was going through this mental health battle, I guess, where I'd get into these loops of negative self-talk, negative perceptions of myself that were really damaging for me. And I could do all the physical activity in the world, but I still couldn't escape my internal kind of demons around my mental health. And so, you start to experience the physical manifestation of that, and you can take a negative journey towards sorting that out. And I probably did. Started dabbling in drugs and making kind of poor choices. And at the start, you kind of, this is doing what I thought it was going to do around my mental health. But progressively over time, it just got worse. And I just was in this consistent loop of negative feedback, and I couldn't break this mental battle that I was having.
It was downward spiral.
Yeah, and it was affecting relationships. It was affecting my relationship with my kids and how I show up for them.
Yeah.
And so I got to a point where I was like, well, this thing isn't working. I can't sweep it under the rug anymore. What can I do to deal with my mental health?
Yep.
And so I found, I started to explore different philosophies and different ways of dealing with mental health. I started listening to podcasts and listening to books. I'm not a big reader, so I just started
neither am I, bro. I listen to them. Audible.
Yeah,
That's me.
Audible
All day. Yeah.
And
I get it.
I found I started hearing about this meditation stuff and
Okay.
mindfulness and all that kind of stuff. And I guess growing up, there was a bit of a stigma around mindfulness and meditation being like a religious Eastern kind of practice.
Buddha sort of thing.
Yeah.
Monks.
And there was a real lack of understanding as to what that would be. And I guess yoga kind of sits alongside that.
100%.
And I guess I grew up in a Christian kind of background as well. So
okay.
Much of that religious ideology kind of informed some of the perspectives that I had on things like meditation, and whether that was direct or not from the people that were around me, but it was kind of a thing that just sat with me growing up. So,
are there any strong traditions or tikanga or ideologies in Christian faith around meditation, or is it just I've not really thought of those two things going together?
Yeah, I guess learning over time is that prayer is probably a form of meditation.
Right. Okay.
Right? It's a repetitive action that you're doing over time. So I think there's connection there, and I haven't actually explored it as much from a Christian point of view. But for me personally, I found meditation and mindfulness through an app called Waking Up by Sam Harris.
Okay.
And
I've heard of that guy.
Yeah, he's practiced, done years of stuff around the brain and how mindfulness works and all that kind of stuff. And he wrote a few books. And I listened to his first book, and then he developed this app. Yeah. And so that negative loop that I was trying to break, I couldn't for so long, and found mindfulness. And I think the stigma of it and what people think of it isn't actually what it was. And there are these courses that you could go through where you just do 10 minutes of meditation a day. And I started to do that, I guess, every day as a practice. And I started to recognize I guess the patterns and the way that I was thinking in this loop that I was in. And the biggest thing that it taught me is that everything is temporary. So emotions, thoughts, they're fleeting. They come and go. And when we focus on our mental well-being, and we're focused on mindfulness and we're focused on our breathing, then we can break some of those loops that are happening, and we can recognize that whatever you're feeling is fleeting. It comes and it goes. Thoughts come and go, and that you're not attached to your thoughts. You aren't your thoughts. It's not your identity. A big part of it was shutting off that kind of, I guess, the front brain, which is your logic part of your brain, that is your hypercritical side of you. So how do you get into a state of mindfulness where you're recognizing that that's a thought that you're having, but it's temporary and it's going to go away.
And it's not who you are. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it's just a thought. And breathing and going through breathing techniques is a really big part of that. And understanding how your breath is the one thing that you have with you all the time. So you can ground yourself in your breath, and you can connect to your breath that then, brings it all together. So it was a really, I'd probably say, the most important thing for my mental well-being.
Really?
Outside of being physically active and connection, to directly look at that negative loop that I was in, and the self-doubt and the, I guess, the deprecation that I was having in my mental health. Going through that journey was a big part of that. And to be honest, there were some encounters that I had within those spaces that I couldn't necessarily explain, of almost like bliss. And so, I think people can shortcut that with drugs or certain substances, but it's there with us in those moments. And
how did you know that you were having that experience? What did it feel like? What were you experiencing? If you can describe it.
It's a hard one to describe. I think one of the things that you've got to be mindful of is that you're not trying to get to this destination.
Right.
It's already there. Finding consciousness and bliss is there. But I guess it's when you start to dissolve your physical being, and you start to connect with something much deeper than just your physical body, and you can get that through your senses, and you can get that through awareness of your surroundings through sound or whatever. But there were just some moments where the world around me dissolved, and I was in a state of bliss, essentially.
Cool.
And it can be dangerous in the sense that, like, well, how do I continue to get that? You know, it's like chasing the dragon kind of thing. But, I think you kind of got to remind yourself that that's not the end point. It's this journey of mental practice, and a recognition that you might do mindfulness every day, but your mind is with you all the time. So some of those practices you've got to bring into your everyday life.
And so do you still practice meditation and mindfulness every day? Is it still something, is it part of your routine, or do you just go and kind of tap into it when you're feeling a bit down?
I think, again, it's like working out, right? So consistency is a really important part of being physically active and being physically well. It's the same for your mind, and you're training your mind essentially to react and respond to different kind of thoughts or feelings. And so currently I'm not practicing a lot, but I can recognize when there's negative kind of patterns turning up, and then recognize that they are temporary. And especially dealing with emotions as a man, how do you respond to your emotions as well, and recognizing them, that they're fleeting as well, that they come and go, and I'm not in a state of anger all the time. It's gonna come. I can embrace it, I can recognize it, and then I can move on. So yeah, it's been a big practice. Outside of just the mindfulness, it's I guess it drives you to be connected to the natural environment is a big part of that as well, because there's nothing like connecting to some other source that's living, that helps with that. And going back to that surfing analogy is, from a sensory point of view, being on the wave, you're moving, you're in a rhythm, you're connected to the feelings of the ocean, the sounds of the birds or the waves, that you're kind of in a space where it's conducive of a really good mindfulness practice. So you can find it not just sitting there, but in different spaces. I think sport is probably another space where you find your flow state. You kind of leave your body in a way where it's not you've shut off those thoughts and you're just in it. And I think flow is a really big part of feeling motivated, feeling achievement when you can get into flow. It's probably an underrated thing that we're not necessarily talking about a lot, but I think flow state is a really big part of well-being and a happy life as well.
There's definitely been times in my life where I've been in, I guess, what you would describe as like a flow state, and when you're there, things just happen. Like it just comes naturally. It's effortless. So understanding how you might kind of get to that space is probably worth investing in or understanding, because when you're in that space, man, you feel unstoppable. Eh?
Exactly. Yeah. Everything just happens, and you've kind of left your body in a way where you're just connected to everything, and everything's all happening at once.
I love it.
Yeah.
You touched a little bit before on sport, and I know that you're heavily involved in kiorahi, but I guess more broadly speaking, Tonga Takur. Kiorahi is something that has become a lot more popular in the last, 10 years or so. Growing up, it's not a game that I played. I've seen it being played before. It looks like a lot of fun. It looks pretty complex if you don't really know what you're looking at. So, but given that you're very involved, can you explain to me, as someone who isn't super familiar with all the rules and all the nuances around kiorahi, pretend like I'm a 10-year-old, can you tell me what is kiorahi?
To start off with, I'd probably put kiorahi under the Tonga Takur
category.
Yeah, banner, umbrella, whatever.
And so what do you mean by Tonga Takur?
Tonga Takur are traditional Māori games. So games that might have been, that our kaumātua grew up with, that might have been traditionally played back in the day, and have kind of, I guess, over time have come into the mainstream or come back to life. Everything we talk about colonization, we talk about the I guess the Māori experience has been a loss of something. So in recent decades or years, there's been the revitalization of Tonga Takur. And I have to recognise a few people that have been a big part of that journey. Dr. Hirangi Heke, Hako Brown, and locally here in Waitaha has been Hepati Harris, Tahirangi Brightwell, and Matua Mike, and a few others like Hamuura, who were part of that kind of initial resurgence of Kiorahi and Tonga Takur in Ōtautahi and Waitaha.
Awesome.
So I want to really recognise them and
all
the
good
mahi
people
that they've done, and the mahi that people have done before them that have got to that point. But Tonga Takur are traditional Māori games. I guess they're all steeped in whakapapa, pūrākau, tikanga, te reo, all the stuff that that we see within kapaka and all the other kaupapa that Māori are heavily invested in. They use the taiao in connection to taiao through the resources that we might use for them. But essentially, they're games that have played in past times that are coming back to life now, and we've been a big part of that journey. And for me personally, it's been a really good connector to te ao Māori. So growing up kind of in the Māori space, also from a Māori Christian kind of point of view, you kind of get exposed to Māori ideas from that point of view. But I hadn't done kapaka as a kid growing up. I was too shy, wouldn't stand on the stage. But I found Tonga Takur through my mahi, and again, physical activity that connected me to something. And so, Tonga Takur has been a big part of my cultural journey, my identity, and I've really invested a lot of my time in learning those games. But Kyod here has been, I guess, is one of the most well-known kēmu in Tonga Takur. And to explain it is quite tricky. There could be, you can watch a video on YouTube and still get confused, but essentially it's a mix of tag in terms of ripper, touch, netball, and handball actually.
Not handball, not handball. The proper handball.
One of the biggest things I think that might throw people off is that it's played on a circular field with some po on the outside that are used to collect points, and then a tipu in the middle, which signifies a rock as part of the pūrākau.
It's often like a barrel in most cases.
A barrel. And I guess, big part of our journey has been ensuring that kupu Māori are being used throughout. So the times we hear people say barrel.
Always, tupu.
Like kapai.
Tupu and po.
Yeah, and po. And so they're all based on the pūrākau as well. And the way the field is laid out is based on pūrākau.
Is there a word for the field?
I guess they're just pāpā-tākoro.
Pāpā-tākoro, but that's cool though, because often we think of pāpā-tākoro, we go, oh, that's just a playground. But it's awesome to hear that pāpā-tākoro literally does mean
playing field.
A playing field, right? So it's totally appropriate. Kapai.
And so I guess you've got two teams, obviously, and we play mixed. So we've got tāne and wahine together, which I think is a really important part.
Is it always mixed?
Everything that we've been doing has been mixed.
That's awesome, eh?
We'll invite schools because we don't want it to be a barrier, so we'll invite schools that might be a single sex school participate. But to be fair, our kohine, our wahine are on. They've got so much strength and capability, and I think it's a really good opportunity to showcase that in a mixed sport. And so there's two objectives essentially that you're playing. So you've got kioma, and ki being the ball and oma being run. That's our touch kind of stuff. So you're running around, you might collect po. There's 7 po, you touch a po, that's 1 point. If you collect 7, that's 7 points. And the way that you'd score is by scoring almost on the try line in a circle. So you're scoring tries essentially as kioma.
Do you collect points just by touching the po, or do you just kind of bank them until you convert them and score the try?
You bank them and then you convert them by scoring the try.
Kapai.
As kioma. So you can. The ball's about the size of a handball. So
it's almost like I've seen them.
And they're foam, so you can. They're quite hard. You can kind of throw them quite hard. But there's no knock-ons. There's no. You can drop it. No forward passes, whatever. And so we play a tag style. So you've got two tags on, and then you've got taniwha. And so that the taniwha comes from the pūrākau as well. And their job is to collect po down here in Waitaha. That's the way we play. They collect po, and then they get into the space called te roto, which is like the lake, again connected to the pūrākau. And their job is to convert those po into points by throwing at the tipu in the middle. And you have like a goalie almost called a kaitiaki that will guard the tipu. And so a real good mix of different sports. We've done some I guess GPS tracking of athletes in the past, and they were putting up numbers like sevens players. So top speed was sevens players. Some of that aerobic capacity, endurance, all that kind of stuff was up there.
Yep.
So probably down here, there's a lot of running. But I guess the really beautiful part about Kyod is that you could be in any shape or size, and depending on how you play, you could still do well. So you don't have to be the quickest on the field to be really effective.
Yep.
Because it's a circle field, you've got so much space, and you've got to be aware of the 360.
Yep.
Whereas in a game of touch or rugby, you're straight on, or a game of netball, you've only got this kind of field of view to work with. Kyod, you've got to be aware of everything around you.
You just a couple of times there, you mentioned about down here, we do this. Down here, it almost sounded as if there were, and it would make perfect sense, being a Tonga Takur, that there were tribal iwi variances, almost like we have dialects in different kupu, and different tikanga.
Yeah.
Is it the same in Tonga Takur?
I think there's probably two schools of thought at the moment.
Okay.
And I can only speak from a Waitaha perspective.
Sure.
And speak about the underlying principles that we have. So we celebrate, I think, the unique variations amongst regions, and we think that's probably the leading light for Kyod, the thing that might set it aside from other sports.
Universal sports. Yeah.
Where there's a standardized way of playing, everyone understands that, and everyone plays the same. But in this case, it's from a Waitaha perspective, we've built something over time, and we've played with rules, and we've worked alongside different people to kind of look to shape that. Yeah. And so that kind of leans into a very Te Ao Māori way of looking at things. So, and I think for us, it would be, if we got to Ngāpuhi kind of country, then it's their tikanga, it's their way of playing, and we'll go up there and we'll respect how they play. So that's the thing I think sets it aside, should be celebrated, and allows for regional autonomy, essentially, that Māori operate in that way, where our autonomy as a region or as a whānau are really important. So how do we bring that to life in a sport?
Definitely gives the old home field advantage like a whole different meaning. It's like if Ngāpuhi's coming down here, it's like we've got to play by Waitaha rules, and vice versa. Yeah. I kind of like it. You know, I only just learned the other day, or a couple of weeks ago actually, that soccer, football, there isn't just one, or maybe there is a standard size field, but apparently even in the very, very top grades, they have different size fields. Yeah. Like you go to some stadiums and they're much bigger than others, and I think that's kind of cool. Yeah. You know, definitely. Like I said, it gives that home team a real advantage. Yeah, but it also exposes, I think, our rangatahi especially to different ways of playing, and it makes the game really dynamic and unique in that way that, you know, they might see something in the way that we play and be like, I want to bring that into our space. And so the mechanism that we use is across all Tonga Takur is this idea called Tatu. And Tatu is the ability to negotiate, essentially. So what we would do for our kaupapa is we'd bring all of our teams together and we'd go, what does Tatu look like for you? Like, what are some of the things you want to negotiate within this space? So it might be, we want to play with 7 players, we want to play with 8. It might be, we want to include a new rule that hasn't been done before. We want to take this thing out. And so rangatahi will stand and they'll share what they want to essentially negotiate. I love that. Which again, I think outside of just the physical part is our rangatahi have an opportunity to stand and speak about the things that they enjoy about Kyod, but also to contribute to the game. And I think what it does is it creates a sense of ownership amongst everybody, rather than it's just Kyod ki Waitaha, the leading people for Kyod. It recognises that, you know, the rangatahi, the players are a big part of that. I guess traditionally Tatu was based on whakapapa between iwi and whānau. So recognising that as part of Tatu, and for Māori is really important, that the relationship between Waitaha and Ngāpuhi or Waitaha and other regions is important, and the way we play might be different because of that relationship that we have. So Tatu is a really important part of Kyod from our perspective. I think it's also good because it gives, I mean, we expect our rangatahi to be as enthusiastic about kapahaka and te reo and tikanga and taonga tākaro, but often we just kind of dictate to them, this is the way it is. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for that. Yeah. But I think it's really empowering when you give people the ability to influence. There's that mana motuhake, that autonomy. If I get to have a say in how it might look for my generation or this cohort, then I think that's very, very empowering, and it makes it much easier to bring people on board on the waka when they feel like they've got some say. Yeah, I think it's clever.
And it stretches people out, I think, from a sport perspective, out of that mind frame around a really standardized, fixed way of playing. This is the way it's always going to be, this is the way it is, to being dynamic and flexible to change. And I think that the only constant is change, right? That's the only thing that we know. And so if we can share with our rangatahi a space that change is consistently happening, or even players, that to being flexible and adaptive to change is part of life, then you're installing that through the game as well. And I think can be exciting, can also be really daunting in the fact that one way that we played last year could be very different to how we play this year. And coaches struggle with it because they want to be planned, they want to have an idea of what it's going to look like, but they also have to be able to shift their game plan to match that.
You can actually, like when you even look at professional sports, there are some codes that have done a really good job and have been really open to new rules, trial this, and being really adaptive as the game's evolved. And if you look at those sports compared to other sports that have been very rigid and gone, this is the way it's always been, those sports that are willing to adapt and change and try new things seem to be the ones that are much more popular these days. I mean, Rugby League is an example. You know, how many rule changes have come in the NRL over the last decade? Some are still here, some are gone by the wayside, whereas you compare it to its rival code rugby, which has been very rigid, very slow to adapt, and you know the popularity of rugby league's kind of going through the roof. I actually think it's really clever. Yeah,
and I think it's the thing that's going to set it aside from other you're competing against other sports, and
totally.
In a sense, there's kapahaka, there's manu kōrero that we've all got to coexist with. So how are we going to set it aside from other things that it becomes something that people are engaging with? And if we look long term to, you know, eventually there might be some professional league or some sort that our whānau are able to excel in something Māori. What's going to be the thing that sets it aside? What's going to be the unique thing? And that could be that there's innovation consistently happening around the field. There's this exciting thing called Tatu that will happen, and that can be a spectator opportunity where the community are engaged in Tatu and they understand it and they can contribute to it. That, you know, one year you see this game being played this way and then the next year, you go around and you tour the country and you're getting exposed to so many different ways of playing, different pūrākau, different connections to Māori, that there's a really exciting component to it that I think personally we've got to retain, not only for the excitement, but to retain the cultural component of Kiorahi and Tonga Takur in themselves. So that really excites me about Kiorahi, and I think for our movement, a big part of that journey has been about incorporating te reo and connecting people to place. That might not be as relevant in other spaces, but for us has been a big part of that. So we encourage te reo all the time. You have to count, at the very least, you have to count your po in te reo.
And learn those words, like tupu, po,
you've got to use all of those kupu. And then we will name at least one po after a significant place or landmark within our area. So it might be maunga tere for kaitahu or maitahu, and we're kind of feeding in those ideas around connection to place.
And get like double pedal if you touch that one. Oh, you do?
Yeah, you
love it.
Points for it. Cool. So there's incentive there.
Yeah.
And for our kura kaupapa, it's no issue. You know, they already know all this stuff. But for our Māori that are in mainstream settings that might not be getting exposed, that are a big cohort that are coming to play, then opportunity to connect to place is a really important part of that. And then by the end of the day, they at least know one landmark, and they're saying, like, Pūtanga Motu has been one of the harder ones. So we kind of have to consistently bring that in. And it's a fun way of bringing te reo in, and they're saying it as they're puffed and kind of running, but at least it's being embedded in the kaupapa. And from our perspective, it's shared across Māori and non-Māori. We've got kaiako that might be Pākehā, but they've embraced Kiorahi and they see their value in it, that we're adding to their journey as well. And for our non-Māori players as well, they're kind of getting connected to Te Ao Māori and te reo and all that kind of stuff in a probably less intrusive way, in the sense that you're kind of doing something, again, you're doing something and activating the body, but you're learning about place names, you're using te reo. It's become a normalized space for it. And yeah, it's not like sit down in a classroom and learn te reo. You're out in a place of context and you're learning about it.
Are there other tikanga that go along with it? Like, are there things that happen before or after a game that are sort of uniquely Māori?
Yeah.
There are?
We used to play papers as rock to determine who would be playing what in those kind of quarters. But we've introduced a Tonga Takur called whānau.
Whānau?
Yeah, which is like a jumping game. You've got 4 actions, and it's pretty similar to paper, scissors, rock, but it's Māori. And so players will do that at the start of the game, and that's how they determine what they're going to be or where they're going to start. And so, again, you're using te reo, you're incorporating more than just kia ora and they're getting exposed to something. There's some athleticism in there as well, so it's a bit of a spectacle.
Good warm-up.
Got some people doing hops and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
So incorporate that. Tatu is that another, I guess, tikanga that we'll have, and we've got it's got its own process that we'll go through. We'll go through pōwhiri or mihi whakatau. So when people come into that space, they'll go through that journey. And then they'll go through that process of mihi and identifying who they are, standing and speaking in front of the group, and then they'll go through that I guess debating kind of. So if they disagree with some of the ture that have been put forward, the rules that have been put forward, then they have a space to speak about it. And we'll go through a bit of a wānanga about why it's important or why it should be used. And then,
but there are tikanga around how that tatu takes place.
And then the group as a whole will make a vote on whether they think that should be incorporated.
That's awesome, bro.
One of the things that we've been trying to do through that process is ensure that rangatahi are the ones leading that. So it's been a bit of a challenge to try and, we don't want to take the Pākeke or the coaches out of it, but there's an opportunity to build their capability or skill outside of that. So we've explored, while they're doing tatu, can we bring in a coach to kind of go through some coaching 101, and then they can do their own little wānanga.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah,
so they're still getting some development.
Yeah, and they're a part of something, but again, it comes back to rangatahi being a part of that process and leading it. And then I think in our more community-based stuff, we'll have tatu on the spot. So we'll line up facing each other before we start a game, and we'll go, what are some of the rules we're going to negotiate with tatu? And some opportunities to be creative and innovative in that space there as well. And I guess for me, from my exploration of tatu, is that it actually is, it's a traditional idea that is really relevant now when we think about inclusion and adaptation. So there's a big move in sport around inclusion, disability, all that kind of stuff. Tatu as an idea tackles all of it. It's adapting a game to meet the needs of the group rather than here's this fixed thing. It's let's do tatu, let's figure out how this is going to work. It's across all of Tonga Takur. So if someone's in a wheelchair, then how do we adapt this game? And it's put on them, on the group to decide how that works.
Cool. Very
tatu
cool.
can be used for advantage. So there's some games that someone has reach or longer arms that they're going to have the advantage. So can you take that away through tatu? So there's some really, really cool ideas in there for, I guess, inclusion and ensuring that that you reduce the barrier for people to play and put ownership on the people playing it rather than me, the facilitator or the coach or whatever. A really cool, unique thing that is direct to Aotearoa and that we can set aside amongst the world. So
I really like as well that it's a way for people to connect with te ao Māori, because for a lot of people, if they didn't grow up in a te ao Māori world, then I guess today that would look like kohanga, kura kaupapa, whatever, on the marae at the pā. If you don't have the privilege, I'll use the word privilege, to be immersed in that aisle, in that world, then for a lot of our whānau, kapahaka gave them an in. But like you said, if you're a shy person, you don't necessarily want to stand up in front of a stage, in front of people on a stage in waiata or haka, then how do you get access to te ao Māori in another way? Kia ora and Tonga Takur. Didn't even think about it, but what an awesome opportunity for some of our whānau and our non-Māori whānau to engage with te ao Māori.
As a facilitator, so I've run workshops in wānanga with Tonga Takur, and much of that has been with non-Māori or those that might be disconnected, and they all come in really sheepish, and they're really like whakamā about coming in.
It doesn't surprise me.
Like any situation, but you get them moving, you get them laughing, you introduce this new idea, And it immediately breaks down some of these barriers. And we've had some really big light bulb moments from people that were really resistant to the idea, that played a game, just a game, from their point of view, but it incorporated te reo, it incorporated pūrākau, it had some of the fundamental ideas around values and tikanga, that they, were able to break it down. They had a laugh, they were able to laugh at themselves, and then they've come forward and said, I was really resistant to engaging in this, but I feel so comfortable, I feel connected to people, and I think that's a big part of the Kemu as well, is that they're a conduit for connection between me and you. They're a conduit for connection between cultures and ideas, because they immediately put you in a space of even playing field. Everyone might be new to this, and connection and whanaungatanga are at the centre of it. They're all built around that idea of building relationship. And there's this one game I play called I Te Timatanga. I've incorporated the creation story for Māori. It's a hand-clapping rhythm game. So everyone's got to keep the rhythm, but you're across from a partner as well. And so you go through a motion of 10 movements. You're using te reo, and you've got to follow a whole group. So kōtahitanga is there in the sense that the beat gets thrown off, everyone gets thrown off, but we're also working together to get through these movements. And so that has been, for me, a really good way of talking about the pūrākau of the creation story that's commonly shared, because there's some natural stuff that happens in that game that you can talk about within that pūrākau, but also they're going through rhythm as a group, and then they're working together with their partner and having a laugh. And when they get it, there's this relief of excitement, this joy that everybody gets out of it. So it's kind of one of my go-to games when I'm feeling like there's some resistance in the group, there's some apprehension. Has been a really good tool for breaking down that stuff. And you can start to incorporate stuff like, how do you greet someone in te reo? As simple as that. Like, how do you say who you are, where you're from? Because there's that one-on-one with that person. And then you'll rotate through the group, and you can get to know other people in another way.
Speed dating.
Yeah, pretty much.
Awesome, bro. And all of that can be, encapsulated within Tonga Takur, as you said. Eh?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just looking at the time. We've been had an awesome call. I've really enjoyed it. Looking ahead, if we just stick with Kiorahi and Tonga Takur specifically, what are got any big goals? Anything that you're working on? The movement?
I think, there's some big things, but again, it's the collective to make that happen. And so we've set up some form of collective in Waitaha, but it might be somewhat formalising that. But again, it's just exposing as many of our whānau to Kiorahi and providing lots of different opportunities to play. So whether it's in a module, whether it's in a tournament, we run an annual tournament based on the Māori battalion. So at the end of the year, people get allocated into teams based on whakapapa or the iwi.
Awesome.
And they're all allocated into the different companies within the Māori battalion. And
that's
so
cool.
Opportunity to learn about the Māori battalion, opportunity to connect with whānau and whakapapa. So we're kind of consistently looking for those opportunities as well as more competitive ones.
Very cool. What about for a non-Māori? Do they have an opportunity to participate?
They participate in that, and so that might be where they grew up, so connection to that.
Cool.
Or it could be that they have whānau connections through marriage or whatever that they can kind of lean on. So, and that's the same for our Pacific whānau. Some of them were in some of the Māori battalions, so we try and look at how they might fit in that space.
Find everyone at home.
Yeah, find everyone at home and kind of grow it as well. Where and the biggest thing for us is how can we educate people about the Māori battalion, which probably isn't as much in the limelight as you might think. So
as it once was, as we kind of shift further and further away from those. And
there's ancestors and stuff that have all been in there. So bringing that to life.
Where do people go to play? Like if I wanted to go and get involved in Kiorahi, I can't necessarily put a team together, so I just want to kind of join a competition.
The first point of call I would say would be go onto the Kia Ora Hiki Waitaha Instagram.
Okay.
And that would be where you'd be able to see what opportunities are there. But we try and reduce the barrier for people to access Kia Ora Hiki. So you could enter as a team or you could enter as individual depending wherever you're going. So we try and ensure that if you don't have a team, you can still come and play. And we run several modules throughout the year. So we've got an indoor module that's played at the moment.
In the winter.
And kind of inside, it's a rāwhiti, so it's kind of, there's a whole lot of wind and stuff. But and then an outdoor module in Hunhei, and then I guess the view is that there'll be more modules popping up. But like we said about regional variation, local variation could be something as well. So something that's played in Hunhei might be very different to some of the ture that are played over in Autonomy or whatever. So we want to celebrate that and kind of be a part of that kind of journey as well. So that would be the view from a local perspective, as well as just providing as many opportunities to play. From a national point of view, I think there's some momentum around what is a national movement look like, and how do you balance the national coordination and delivery with the regional variations, and what is the appropriate model for that. So we're exploring what that might look like.
Are there challenges around trying to bring something that's very traditional and trying to make it relevant and give it what it needs in order to be able to adapt, balancing that with competitiveness and all of the different tribal sort of variations? Like, what are some of the biggest challenges, do you think?
I think the challenge is that we haven't had time to explore what that looks like. So there's been a leap to standardization for the sake of convenience, for ensuring that there's a certainty around it, and for reefing. But what might it look
reefing as well, eh?
Which is a tricky part, because but again, reefs have to be adaptable and flexible anyway. Like even in rugby league or rugby, the
rules can change.
Interpretation of the rule is different based on the reef or the kaiwa. So for us, it's we can actually build that skill set to be adaptive and to change as well. So I think it's just exploring that and probably going, what is the possibility? What does this look like? And how do we ensure that at the center of it, culture is the most important thing? Competition comes, but retaining the culture and the important cultural elements are there. So that's a challenge. I think the differing views around how kīorahi should be or shouldn't be played, or what are the things you let go of versus what are the things you keep, is a part of that. But again, it's about seeing the possibility, and it's about exploring, can we have a competitive level competition where, regional variation is the thing? Or do we go on a bit of a hikoi or a journey as a group and go, can we take a ture from every region and build something based on that? There's so many ways that we can explore it that just haven't happened. So I'd love to think about that. And even from a governance structural point of view, we can go down the route of a national sport organisation like a New Zealand Rugby, or we can go, what makes the most sense to Māori first, and how we operate, and then how do we build something based on that? And so we're experimenting with a decentralised model in some ways, where there's cohesion across the country and coordination and connection, but regions retain their autonomy. There's, I guess my view for the future of kīorahi is that it's going to be a really strong domestic game played in Aotearoa. There might be opportunities outside of that, but if we can do that really well, like the NRL is a really good example. Yes, New Zealand has one team in there, but they are such a strong domestic competition that's almost where you could see kīorahi going, in a sense that the regions are where all the talent is and where the strength is, and that's the opportunity, I think, moving forward. There is a case for New Zealand teams, but where do they play? Who do they play against if there's no international kind of game? And then the question might be, is it something that should be international, or is it something that we could work with Indigenous cultures with? So could we go to the islands and say, here's this game, here's how we play it over in Aotearoa. How do you play it in the Cook Islands?
What's your version of
Tonga? What are the pūrākau that you can bring to life through this? What is it like in Samoa and Tonga that you can, what are the natural resources that you have that might support that? So I think personally, speaking for myself, that's the vision that I have, that Indigenous cultures can play it and can adapt it based on their own pūrākau and their own ways of being. And then how beautiful it would be to be able to go over to North America, where the Indigenous people are, and they're playing kīorahi, but they've got a different twist and beautiful their pūrākau and language to life through it. So I think, for me personally, that's the vision of the future.
Awesome.
There's some real risk, I think, if we go down a mainstream standardized approach, that other countries might pick it up, and then it gets commercialized or standardized in a way that doesn't necessarily benefit the interests of Māori. So and potential for it to get diluted as a important part of our identity. Lacrosse is probably a really good example of that.
Because it's is it Canadian?
Indigenous Canada, but was taken into the mainstream, and is not their thing anymore. So it's unique.
Very good point.
Yeah, Māori, and my point of view is that it stays that way.
I agree.
The other thing would be that our kura kaupapa are really steeped in te reo and te ao Māori. So the stuff that we're trying to do from our perspective might not necessarily meet their needs. So again, it's like balancing that with going, okay, they've got all the te reo, they've got all the tikanga. What is that extra layer that they might need support with when it comes to kiorahi?
Well, where I really saw kiorahi and was just totally blown away was just recently. It was either this year or last year at Wikiha. Yeah, that was so cool down at Lancaster Park. And I saw a drone shot as well. I don't know how many fields they had.
15
pāpā tākaro. Yeah. And it was just so cool. And I reckon, because they're circular, when everyone had kind of dispersed and gone their own separate way, there must have been a few locals that kind of rocked up and were like, what is going on? You know, they almost look like those alien circular patterns that you sort of see in some of those crops. Yeah. Very, very cool though. And that was kura kaupapa from all over the motu coming together and playing, I presume, a regional version of kiorahi. Yeah. So cool.
Other benefit that we have now that we're kind of in this growth space is to learn from others. Yep. And learn, where the challenges have been. If you look at New Zealand rugby and the board challenges, and then you look at netball that's struggling in a sense around viewership, and they've got a massive base of community players, but it's not translating into that. And then recently with rugby, how a competition been shut down for a couple of weeks because of sideline behaviour. How do we start to look at that stuff now, and it becomes baked into the fabric of kiorahi now, rather than getting another 10 years down the track and we've got player behaviour, abusive kaiwawau in there? Can we address that now and build in, I guess, tikanga as part of that? And so from a Waitaha perspective, we're really trying to tackle that now in a positive way, so that it becomes like it's not like I'm going to get penalised. We had to start with a penalised thing, but whether it's incorporating values, so in some of our competitions, winners are chosen based on how they uplift values in that space. They still play hard as, they still play competitive, but they're actually getting points allocated based on their ability to connect with others, their demonstrating of values. So I think there's some really valuable parts in that. And then what is the norm around player behaviour and how you might uplift everybody? So I don't think anybody should be receiving abuse on the sideline, and I don't think kaiwawau especially. If we're trying to build a volunteer base, should be copying stuff. Yes, calls come and go, but
it's sport though.
Yeah, and I think there's some really ugly sides of sport that we could get ahead of well before they become a challenge.
And just learning, I suppose. There's so many examples of, there's so many other sports out there that you can look to and kind of go, actually, we really love that aspect, but not so much that. So how can we ensure that we mitigate all the risks so that doesn't kind of become part of our kaupapa?
Could we also see things like Tatu come to life in mainstream sports, like netball's challenge in the track? What might it look like to negotiate roles in that space? And
okay, cool.
Innovation and all that kind of stuff.
Very Māori way of thinking. I love it, bro. Yeah. Hey, I've really enjoyed this kōrero e hoa, and would love to carry on, but I know that you've got to get back to mahi, and I've got some stuff to do as well. But look, I really just want to take a moment to say a few things. First of all, really nothing but respect for you and the way that you've been able to break that generational cycle around movement and hauora, generally speaking. I love the fit dad approach that you're taking, wrestling with your tama, trying to be that role model that unfortunately you didn't have growing up, not for long enough anyway. So nothing but respect for you. I love that you are conscious and thinking about what it means to be a good tāne Māori especially, and that you're so passionate about bringing some of these Tonga Takur back into the spotlight and giving people an opportunity to participate in Tonga Takur, but also more broadly speaking in Te Ao Māori. So thank you for being a wonderful example for me and for others as well. Really admire everything you're doing. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe. Thank you, bro.
Anything else you want to share, bro, before we wrap up?
Oh, that's probably it. Thank you.
Loved your kōrero today, bro. So thank you very, very much. I'm sure others will get a lot out of it. And I look forward to sitting down later on and having another kōrero.
See how everything's going.
How
we're tracking.
Kia ora, bro. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.